The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the concrete bunker beneath Berlin, casting harsh shadows across the maps spread on the oak table. It was November 15th, 1943. Colonel Heinrich Müller's hands trembled slightly as he placed the intelligence report before General Heinz Guderian. The paper bore the stamp of the Abwehr, German military intelligence, and contained numbers that would change everything. Herr General, Müller's voice was barely above a whisper, the Americans, they produced 47,000 tanks last year alone. Guderian's weathered face remained stoic, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the report. For comparison, Germany had managed to produce fewer than 6,000 tanks in the same period. The silence stretched like a taut wire until Guderian finally spoke, his words cutting through the bunker's stale air like a blade. 47,000. He repeated the number as if testing its weight. They're not building tanks, Müller. They're manufacturing defeat. Ours. The room fell silent except for the distant rumble of Allied bombers overhead. In that moment, in that underground chamber where Germany's greatest military minds gathered, the war's outcome crystallized with brutal clarity. America had transformed warfare itself, turning their automobile factories into weapons of industrial annihilation. The story of how this industrial revolution sealed Germany's fate began 4 years earlier, when German panzer divisions rolled across Europe with seemingly unstoppable force. September 1st, 1939. The morning mist clung to the Polish countryside as the rumble of engines shattered the dawn silence. German Panzer I and II tanks rolled across the border, their steel treads crushing everything beneath them. This was Blitzkrieg, lightning war, and it represented the pinnacle of German military innovation. Each tank was a masterpiece of Krupp-Esche engineering, handcrafted with precision that reflected centuries of German mechanical expertise. The Panzer III, Germany's primary battle tank in those early years, embodied this philosophy perfectly. Every component was manufactured to exacting standards, each piece individually inspected and fitted. German tank crews trained for months on their specific vehicles, learning every bolt and rivet. The tanks were complex, sophisticated machines that required skilled maintenance crews and specialized parts, but they worked with devastating effectiveness. Within 6 weeks, Poland had fallen. The world watched in stunned silence as German armored columns carved through Polish defenses like a hot knife through butter. The Poles, still relying heavily on cavalry charges and antiquated equipment, stood no chance against this mechanized hurricane. German tank commanders like Heinz Guderian had proven their theories about armored warfare in the most decisive way possible. The success continued through 1940. Norway fell in 2 months. Denmark surrendered in hours. Then came the crown jewel of German military achievement, the fall of France. On May 10, 1940, German panzer divisions punched through the Ardennes forest, a move so audacious that French commanders initially dismissed it as a diversion. Within 6 weeks, German tanks were rolling down the Champs-Élysées. The secret to German success lay not just in their tanks, but in their tactical doctrine. German commanders understood that tanks weren't just mobile artillery. They were instruments of shock and psychological warfare. They concentrated their armor into powerful spearheads that could punch holes in enemy lines, then exploit those breaches with lightning speed. Combined with Stuka dive bombers and motorized infantry, German panzer divisions became an unstoppable force. Each German tank represented months of careful craftsmanship. The Panzer IV, which would become Germany's workhorse throughout the war, required over 300,000 individual components, each manufactured to precise tolerances. German factories operated more like workshops than mass production facilities. Skilled craftsmen assembled each tank with meticulous attention to detail. Quality control was paramount. Every tank had to meet exacting standards before leaving the factory. This approach reflected deep-seated German industrial philosophy. Since the days of Otto von Bismarck, German manufacturing had emphasized precision, craftsmanship, and engineering excellence over speed and quantity. German engineers believed that superior technology and better-trained crews could overcome numerical disadvantages. Their early wartime success seemed to validate this approach completely. By mid-1941, German forces had conquered most of continental Europe. Their tank losses had been minimal, and their production methods seemed perfectly adequate for their needs. German generals spoke confidently of ending the war before American industrial capacity could make a difference. They calculated that Germany needed only to produce enough tanks to replace combat losses and equip new formations. Mass production, they believed, was an American obsession born of inferior engineering capabilities. This confidence reached its peak with the Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. On June 22, 1941, over 3,000 German tanks rolled across the Soviet border. Within months, they had destroyed thousands of Soviet tanks and captured millions of prisoners. German tank crews reported that Soviet equipment was primitive and poorly maintained. Victory seemed inevitable, and German production philosophy appeared vindicated once again. But even as German tanks advanced across the Russian steppes, an industrial awakening was beginning across the Atlantic that would ultimately doom the Third Reich. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor burned as Japanese bombs found their targets with devastating precision. President Franklin Roosevelt stood before Congress the following day, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the challenge ahead. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The attack galvanized American public opinion, but it also presented a sobering reality. America's military was woefully unprepared for global warfare. The U.S. Army possessed fewer than 1,000 tanks, most of them obsolete designs that would be death traps against German panzers. American tank production in 1941 totaled just over 4,000 units, respectable for peacetime but laughably inadequate for the industrial war that lay ahead. Roosevelt understood the challenge with crystal clarity. This would not be won through superior tactics or battlefield brilliance alone. This would be an industrial war decided by which side could produce more weapons, faster, and in greater quantities than ever before imagined. America possessed one crucial advantage that would prove decisive: an automobile industry that had already revolutionized mass production. The transformation began immediately. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt established the War Production Board under Donald Nelson, a former Sears executive who understood mass production intimately. Nelson's mandate was simple but staggering: convert American industry from consumer goods to military production on a scale never before attempted. The automobile industry, which had produced over 4 million cars in 1941, would become the backbone of this industrial mobilization. Henry Ford, now in his 70s, initially resisted converting his factories to tank production. Ford had built his empire on the principle that automobiles should be affordable for ordinary Americans, not instruments of warfare. But the attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. By January 1942, Ford Motor Company had signed contracts to produce tanks, aircraft engines, and other military equipment. The transformation of River Rouge, Ford's massive production complex in Michigan, began almost immediately. The challenges seemed insurmountable. Tanks were far more complex than automobiles, requiring specialized armor steel, precision-manufactured gun barrels, and sophisticated fire control systems. Traditional tank production relied on skilled craftsmen who could adapt to each vehicle's unique requirements. But American manufacturers approached the problem differently. Instead of seeing tanks as individual masterpieces, they viewed them as products to be manufactured in vast queue, and tidies using proven assembly line techniques. William Knudsen, former president of General Motors, became Roosevelt's production czar. Knudsen understood both the automotive industry and the scale of the challenge ahead. He knew that American success would depend not on building better tanks than the Germans, at least not initially, but on building vastly more tanks than anyone had ever thought possible. Quality would come through standardization and continuous improvement, not individual craftsmanship. The first major American tank production program centered on the M3 Lee, a hastily designed medium tank that reflected American industrial philosophy. Unlike German tanks, which required months of careful assembly, the M3 was designed for rapid production using existing industrial capabilities. Components were standardized wherever possible. Manufacturing tolerances were relaxed to acceptable levels that still ensured reliability while dramatically increasing production speed. American factories began working around the clock. The Chrysler Corporation converted their tank arsenal in Detroit, creating production lines that could manufacture tanks 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers who had been building cars months earlier now found themselves assembling armored fighting vehicles. The learning curve was steep, but American industrial managers applied lessons learned from decades of automobile production to accelerate the process. By late 1942, the results were becoming apparent. American tank production was climbing steadily, reaching levels that German intelligence found difficult to believe. But this was only the beginning. The real transformation was still ahead. as American industry prepared to apply assembly line techniques to tank production with unprecedented efficiency and scale. The revolution truly began when American manufacturers stopped thinking like traditional weapons producers and started thinking like Henry Ford building Model T automobiles in 1913. The philosophy that would ultimately overwhelm German production had its roots in a simple observation made decades earlier by a Michigan farm boy who became America's most famous industrialist. Henry Ford had recognized that complex products could be manufactured efficiently if they were broken down into simple, repetitive tasks performed by specialized workers using standardized components. This approach had revolutionized automobile production, making cars affordable for ordinary Americans. Now it would revolutionize warfare itself. German tank production emphasized individual excellence. Each Panzer IV required skilled craftsmen who understood metallurgy, precision machining, and complex mechanical systems. These craftsmen worked slowly and carefully, producing tanks that were mechanical marvels, but took months to complete. German factories were essentially large workshops where skilled artisans created masterpieces of engineering one piece at a time. American manufacturers approached the problem from the opposite direction. Instead of viewing tanks as complex mechanical systems requiring individual attention, they saw them as assemblies of standardized components that could be manufactured separately and combined efficiently. The M4 Sherman tank, which became America's primary battle tank, was specifically designed for mass production using automotive industry techniques. Every component of the Sherman was engineered for manufacturability. The hull was welded rather than cast in complex shapes, making production faster and requiring fewer skilled workers. The transmission, engine, and other mechanical systems used automotive-grade components wherever possible, leveraging existing supply chains and manufacturing expertise. Most importantly, the entire tank was designed so that workers with minimal training could assemble it quickly and reliably. Henry Ford himself became personally involved in tank production, bringing his revolutionary assembly line concepts to military manufacturing. At the Willow Run facility outside Detroit, Ford engineers created production lines that could manufacture bombers using the same principles that had made Model T production so efficient. Workers performed specialized tasks, components moved along conveyor systems, and quality control was built into every step of the process rather than depending on individual craftsman expertise. The transformation wasn't limited to Ford. General Motors converted their locomotive works in LaGrange, Illinois, creating tank production lines that operated with clockwork precision. Chrysler built an entirely new tank arsenal in Detroit specifically designed for high-volume production. Each facility applied decades of automotive manufacturing experience to create production systems that could manufacture tanks faster than anyone had thought possible. American production managers also revolutionized the supply chain. Instead of relying on specialized military contractors, they leveraged the entire American automotive industry. Steering wheels came from companies that made car steering systems. Radio equipment came from manufacturers who had been making car radios. Engines were produced by companies that had been making truck and tractor engines for decades. This distributed production system proved far more resilient and scalable than traditional military manufacturing approaches. Quality control represented another fundamental difference in philosophy. German manufacturers relied on skilled inspectors who examined each component individually, rejecting anything that didn't meet exacting standards. American manufacturers implemented statistical quality control, using mathematical techniques to ensure that production processes consistently produced acceptable results. This approach allowed them to maintain quality while dramatically increasing production speed. The workforce transformation was equally revolutionary. German tank production required years of apprenticeship and training to develop the necessary skills. American factories trained workers in weeks rather than years, using simplified assembly processes and specialized tools that didn't require extensive mechanical knowledge. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking on roles that had traditionally been reserved for skilled male craftsmen. By early 1943, American tank production was reaching levels that seemed impossible just 18 months earlier. The Chrysler tank arsenal alone was producing more tanks per month than entire German tank production had achieved in 1940. But this was still just the beginning. American industry was learning, improving, and scaling up production systems that would soon overwhelm German manufacturing capacity completely. The contrast in production philosophy was becoming stark. German engineers continued to refine their designs, making tanks more sophisticated but also more complex and time-consuming to produce. American engineers focused on simplification, standardization, and manufacturing efficiency. The Sherman tank wasn't necessarily better than German tanks in individual combat, but American factories could produce 5 Shermans in the time it took German factories to produce 1 Panzer IV. This industrial transformation created ripple effects throughout American society. Cities like Detroit became boom towns as workers flocked to defense plants offering high wages and steady employment. The Great Depression finally ended as unemployment virtually disappeared. American industry was not just producing tanks, it was producing prosperity and national confidence on a scale that matched its industrial output. The psychological impact on German leadership was beginning to register as intelligence reports brought increasingly alarming news about American production capabilities. The breakthrough moment came during the summer of 1943, when American production systems achieved a level of efficiency that even their own planners had considered optimistic. The numbers were staggering, but they represented more than statistics. They represented a fundamental shift in the nature of modern warfare. At the Chrysler Tank Arsenal, workers were completing 1 M4 Sherman tank every hour during peak production periods. The facility operated 3 shifts, producing tanks around the clock with mechanical precision that would have impressed Henry Ford himself. Each Sherman required approximately 1,000 man-hours to complete, a fraction of the time needed for comparable German tanks. The secret lay not in working faster, but in working smarter through continuous process improvement and ruthless standardization. The production explosion wasn't limited to a single facility. Across America, dozens of plants were converting to tank production using similar techniques. The Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio retooled their train manufacturing facilities to produce tanks. The Pressed Steel Car Company in Pennsylvania converted from railroad car manufacturing to armored vehicle production. Even smaller companies contributed specialized components, creating a distributed production network that proved remarkably resilient to disruption. German intelligence officers struggled to comprehend the scale of American production. Reports from German agents in neutral countries brought increasingly alarming statistics. In 1942, American factories had produced over 25,000 tanks. By 1943, production was approaching 30,000 units annually and still climbing. These numbers seemed impossible to German planners who had been conditioned to think in terms of hundreds or thousands of tanks, not tens of thousands. The psychological impact on German commanders was profound and immediate. General Guderian, the father of German armored warfare, received regular intelligence briefings about American production capabilities. Each report brought more disturbing news. American factories were not just producing tanks faster than Germany, they were producing tanks faster than Germany could destroy them, even under the most optimistic battlefield scenarios. Colonel Hans von Luck, serving on the Eastern Front, later recalled the moment when German tank crews began encountering American-produced equipment in Soviet hands through Lend-Lease shipments. The quality was not always superior to our own, he remembered, but the quantity was overwhelming. For every tank we destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. The psychological effect on German crews was devastating as they realized they were fighting not just the Red Army, but American industrial capacity itself. The strategic implications became clear to German high command during planning sessions for future operations. Traditional German military doctrine had always emphasized decisive battles that could destroy enemy forces and end campaigns quickly. But American production meant that decisive battles were becoming impossible. Even total German victory in a major engagement would only provide temporary advantage before American replacements restored Allied strength. German tank production, meanwhile, was reaching its practical limits. Despite heroic efforts by German workers and increasingly desperate measures by Nazi leadership, German factories could not match American output. Skilled craftsmen were being drafted into military service, creating labor shortages in critical industries. Allied bombing was disrupting production and supply chains. Most critically, Germany lacked the raw materials needed for massive production increases, particularly the high-grade steel required for tank armor. The contrast became even more stark when German intelligence analyzed American production methods. German observers who had visited American factories before the war reported that Americans were building tanks the same way they built automobiles, using assembly lines, standardized components, and semi-skilled workers who could to be trained quickly. This approach violated every principle of German manufacturing philosophy, yet it was producing results that German methods could never match. General Georg Thomas, head of the German War Economy and Armaments Office, prepared increasingly desperate reports for Hitler about the production imbalance. Thomas calculated that Germany would need to increase tank production by at least 400% to match American output, an impossibility given existing constraints. His reports were often ignored or rejected as defeatist, but the mathematics were undeniable. The turning point in German thinking came when intelligence officers began analyzing American production potential rather than just current output. American automobile factories had produced over 4 million cars annually before the war, demonstrating production capacity that dwarfed anything in Europe. If that entire capacity was converted to military production, American output could reach levels that would make resistance futile regardless of German tactical superiority. This realization spread through German command structure like a virus, undermining confidence in strategic planning. Field commanders who had previously focused on tactical problems began asking questions about long-term sustainability. How could Germany win a war of attrition against an enemy that could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted? The answer, increasingly clear to those willing to face reality, was that Germany could not win such a war. The mathematical certainty of defeat was becoming undeniable, but the full scope of American industrial dominance would become even more apparent in the war's final phases. By 1944, American tank production had reached levels that redefined what was possible in industrial warfare. The numbers told a story of triumph that went beyond mere statistics. They represented the complete transformation of global military balance through industrial might rather than battlefield superiority. The final production figures were staggering beyond any time military planners had considered possible when the war began. In 1944 alone, American factories produced over 29,000 tanks of all types. For the entire war period from 1942 to 1945, American production totaled approximately 88,000 tanks, including nearly 50,000 M4 Sherman medium tanks. These numbers represented more tank production than all other combatant nations combined, including Germany, the Soviet Union, and Britain. The contrast with German production was devastating for Nazi strategic planning. Germany's total tank production for the entire war never exceeded 25,000 units, despite starting the war with significant industrial advantages and controlling much of Europe's manufacturing capacity. Even at peak production in 1944, German factories managed fewer than 19,000 tanks and assault guns, impressive by pre-war standards but hopelessly inadequate against American industrial output. The battlefield impact became apparent during major Allied offensives in 1944 and 1945. Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings, was supported by thousands of American-produced tanks that overwhelmed German defenders through sheer numerical superiority. German tank crews reported facing seemingly endless streams of Sherman tanks that could be replaced faster than they could be destroyed. The psychological effect was crushing. Even tactical victories felt meaningless when enemy replacements arrived within hours. General Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in Normandy, wrote desperately to Hitler about the impossibility of stopping Allied advances when they possessed such overwhelming material advantages. "We are fighting not just the British and Americans," Rommel observed, "but the entire industrial capacity of the United States. Every tank we destroy is replaced by two more. This is not warfare, it is industrial annihilation." The production success created strategic options for Allied commanders that had been impossible in previous wars. Tanks could be used aggressively without concern for irreplaceable losses. Entire armored divisions could be equipped with standardized vehicles that simplified maintenance and logistics. Most importantly, American production allowed simultaneous major operations on multiple fronts, something that would have been impossible with traditional manufacturing approaches. German commanders found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited resources. Intelligence reports from the Western Front described American tank formations that operated with casual disregard for losses because replacements were always available. German tank crews, operating increasingly obsolete equipment that couldn't be replaced, faced psychological pressure that undermined their effectiveness regardless of training or experience. The final phase of the war demonstrated the complete collapse of German resistance in the face of American industrial superiority. During the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive, German forces initially achieved tactical surprise and local success. But American commanders simply called for replacement tanks and equipment, receiving massive reinforcements that turned initial German gains into devastating defeats. German forces that had expended irreplaceable resources in their offensive found themselves facing fresh American units equipped with the latest production models. The industrial war's outcome became mathematically certain by early 1945. American factories were still increasing production even as German manufacturing collapsed under Allied bombing and resource shortages. The Red Army was advancing with thousands of American-produced tanks received through Lend-Lease, while British forces operated increasingly American equipment. Germany faced a future where enemy production advantages would only increase, making continued resistance not just futile but suicidal. German generals began surrendering not because they had been outfought tactically, but because they recognized the mathematical impossibility of victory against American industrial capacity. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B in the Ruhr Pocket, reportedly told his staff that continuing resistance would only increase German casualties without affecting the war's outcome. The Americans could replace every loss. Germany could not. The war's end came not through decisive battles or brilliant strategies, but through the inexorable pressure of American industrial superiority that made German resistance unsustainable regardless of tactical skill or strategic planning. The final accounting revealed the true scope of America's industrial victory, but the human cost of German miscalculation extended far beyond simple production statistics. When German forces finally surrendered in May 1945, the statistical comparison told a story of industrial dominance that had reshaped warfare forever. American tank production during the war years totaled nearly 90,000 units compared to Germany's 25,000. But these numbers represented more than manufacturing success. They represented a fundamental shift in how modern wars would be fought and won. The human cost of German resistance in the face of overwhelming American production was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of German tank crews, mechanics, and support personnel had died operating equipment that became increasingly obsolete as American production reached peak efficiency. German training programs continued producing skilled tank crews even when replacement tanks were unavailable, creating a tragic waste of human resources that highlighted the futility of German strategy. American production success had created strategic realities that German commanders finally began acknowledging after the war. General Guderian, interviewed by Allied intelligence officers, admitted that German resistance had become pointless once American production reached full capacity. "We were fighting American factories," Guderian explained, "not just American soldiers. How do you defeat factories with tanks?" The interrogation reports from captured German officers revealed the psychological impact of facing unlimited American production. Tank ace Michael Whitman, before his death in Normandy, had reportedly told fellow officers that destroying Allied tanks felt meaningless because replacements arrived faster than victories could be achieved. The knowledge that every German loss was irreplaceable while American losses were quickly replaced undermined German morale regardless of tactical success. Post-war analysis revealed that German intelligence had actually provided accurate reports about American production capabilities as early as 1943, but Nazi leadership had rejected these reports as impossible or exaggerated. Hitler himself had dismissed intelligence estimates of American tank production as Jewish American propaganda, refusing to believe that any nation could produce weapons on such a scale. This denial prevented German strategic adaptation that might have prolonged the war. The broader economic impact of American production extended far beyond military victory. The industrial mobilization that produced 90,000 tanks also generated unprecedented prosperity that ended the Great Depression permanently. Cities like Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland became boom towns as defense production created millions of high-paying jobs. The social transformation was as complete as the military victory, creating an American middle class with purchasing power that would drive post-war economic growth. German post-war memoirs consistently returned to the theme of American industrial superiority as the decisive factor in their defeat. General Friedrich von Mellenthin wrote extensively about the psychological impact of facing enemies who could afford to lose equipment because replacements were always available. American tank crews fought differently, von Mellenthin observed, because they knew their tanks were expendable. German crews fought to preserve irreplaceable equipment, which made them cautious and defensive. The strategic lessons were clear to military analysts on both sides. Future wars would be decided not by tactical brilliance or superior training, but by industrial capacity and production efficiency. The side that could produce more equipment faster would possess decisive advantages that tactical skill could not overcome. American success had demonstrated that mass production techniques could be applied to military equipment with devastating effectiveness. The transformation of warfare through industrial production created lasting changes in military doctrine worldwide. The concept of decisive battles gave way to industrial attrition, where victory went to the side that could sustain losses longer. American production methods became the template for military manufacturing globally, with emphasis on standardization, mass production, and rapid replacement rather than individual excellence. German attempts to compete through superior technology ultimately proved futile against American quantity. Advanced German tanks like the Tiger and Panther were mechanical marvels that could outfight American Shermans individually, but they could never be produced in sufficient numbers to affect strategic outcomes. The lesson was clear. Adequate equipment available in overwhelming quantities would always defeat superior equipment available in limited numbers. The war's end marked the beginning of American industrial dominance that would reshape global politics for decades. The same factories that had produced tanks would produce automobiles, appliances, and consumer goods that made America the world's dominant economic power. The industrial transformation that had defeated Germany became the foundation for American prosperity that lasted throughout the 20th century. In the quiet of post-war reflection, the true magnitude of what had occurred became clear. America had not just won a military victory but had demonstrated a new form of warfare based on industrial supremacy rather than battlefield tactics. The story of American tank production during World War II represents more than military history. It marks the moment when industrial capacity became the ultimate weapon of modern warfare. The transformation of automobile assembly lines into instruments of victory demonstrated that future conflicts would be won in factories rather than on battlefields, decided by production managers rather than field commanders. The German recognition of defeat when faced with American manufacturing superiority revealed a fundamental truth about 20th century warfare. Traditional military virtues, tactical skill, individual heroism, superior training, remained important but were no longer sufficient for victory against overwhelming industrial production. The side that could produce more equipment faster would possess advantages that courage and competence could not overcome. This industrial revolution in warfare extended far beyond World War II, establishing principles that would govern military conflict for decades. The Cold War became fundamentally a competition between industrial systems, with victory going to whichever side could sustain higher levels of military production over extended periods. The lesson of American tank production, that quantity could triumph over quality through efficient manufacturing, became doctrine for military planners worldwide. The human dimension of this transformation remains equally significant. Millions of American workers who had never seen a battlefield contributed directly to military victory through their labor in converted automobile factories. The war demonstrated that entire populations could participate in modern conflict through industrial production, making civilian manufacturing capacity a legitimate military target and civilian workers essential participants in national defense. Perhaps most importantly, the American approach to tank production revealed the power of democratic industrial systems to mobilize resources for common purposes. The same entrepreneurial energy and innovative thinking that had created America's consumer economy proved capable of producing military victory when directed toward that goal. The flexibility and efficiency of American manufacturing, developed through decades of commercial competition, provided decisive advantages that centrally planned economies could not match. The echoes of this industrial triumph continue to resonate in contemporary conflicts, where victory often depends on which side can sustain higher levels of equipment production and technological innovation over extended periods. The lesson learned when German commanders recognized their defeat in the face of American tank production remains relevant. Modern warfare rewards industrial capacity and manufacturing efficiency as much as tactical brilliance and individual courage.